The wind in Red Butte was a thief. It stole the moisture from the soil, the heat from your bones, and the words from your mouth if you weren't careful. It was the first thing Eliza Wynne felt that spring morning in 1887, a dry, persistent scouring against her cheek as she urged the last of the herd toward the corral. The sun was still a pale promise behind the jagged teeth of the Wasatch Range, and the air held a chill that lied about the heat to come. Herding was a two-person job, but since her father had passed, it had become a one-woman struggle. The cattle, lean and ill-tempered after a winter of scarce grazing, were restless. They could smell the sparse green shoots in the high country and wanted to run. But the fence line, patched with scavenged wire and hope, wouldn't hold them. Neither would the bank in town, which held the note on their land. The weight of it felt heavier than a winter snowpack. Her Aunt Mabel, stirring inside the small clapboard house, had a way of making light of their burdens. "If the good Lord won't give us rain, Eliza," she'd said just last night, her knitting needles clicking like busy crickets, "we'll have to milk the clouds." Eliza had managed a smile, but the cracked water jug by the hearth told the truer story. Their hope, like their water supply, was dwindling. It was the unnatural stillness that caught her attention first. A horse, reins trailing in the dust, stood with its head low near a splintered section of the fence. It was a fine animal, a deep chestnut with the kind of powerful build that spoke of money. But its saddle was empty. Eliza's gaze followed the drag marks in the red dirt to a shape huddled against the fence post. A man. The cattle lowed, sensing her distraction, and pushed against the weakest part of the fence. A board groaned in protest. She had a choice, stark and immediate as the landscape itself secure the herd, their only real asset against the bank's looming deadline, or tend to the stranger. Every instinct screamed to fix the fence, to save what was hers, but her father's voice echoed in her memory, quiet and firm. "You do what's right, not what's easy." She swore under her breath, a sharp, frustrated sound swallowed by the wind. Tying her own mare to a solid post, she grabbed her rifle from its scabbard not out of aggression, but out of habit, and walked toward the fallen rider. He was big, dressed in clothes that were dusty but well made. A dark felt hat lay a few feet away. His duster was pushed open, revealing a dark, wet stain spreading across his left shoulder. Blood. His leg was bent at an angle that made her stomach clench. The denim of his trousers stretched tight over a swollen knee. A red bandana, knotted loosely around his neck, was the only slash of vibrant color in the muted landscape. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Mabel Eliza's shout was thin against the wind, but her aunt had the ears of a prairie dog. The screen door of the house slapped shut, and Mabel came hurrying out, wiping her hands on her apron, her face a mask of practical concern. "Lord have mercy." "Did the wind blow this one in?" Mabel asked, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. She knelt beside Eliza, her movements surprisingly nimble for a woman of her years. "Well, he's not getting any better lying here. We can't leave him for the buzzards to argue over." Getting him to the barn was a feat of grit and leverage. He was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. They looped his arms over their shoulders, his boots dragging through the dirt, and half carried, half pulled him toward the cool, hay-scented dimness of the barn. They laid him out on a pile of clean straw in an empty stall, the morning light striping his still form through the gaps in the boards. "Go on and see to the herd," Mabel said, already rolling up her sleeves. "I'll get his boots off, and find out if he's carrying anything more interesting than trouble." Eliza worked quickly, her hands sure as she hammered a loose plank back into place, her mind racing. Strangers in Red Butte usually meant one of three things miners heading for the played-out silver claims: salesmen for the railroad, or trouble. This man felt like the third kind. Silas Rook, the man who ran the local mining office and held sway over the new railroad spur, had been making trouble for weeks, quietly buying up deeds and posting new water tariffs that were choking the life out of small ranchers like them. Rook's ambition was as vast and dry as the valley itself. When she returned to the barn, Mabel had managed to get his boots and gun belt off. The leg was bad, the knee swollen to twice its normal size, a deep, angry purple, but the shoulder was worse. Mabel had cut away the fabric of his shirt with a skinning knife. The entry wound was small and dark, deceptively neat. There was no exit wound. The bullet was still in there. "Doc Finch is over in town, delivering the Miller baby," Mabel said, her voice tight. "Won't be back before noon, if we're lucky." Eliza didn't wait. She went to the small chest in the corner of the barn where she kept her remedies. Her father had taught her the old ways, the herbs that grew in the high canyons and the poultices that could draw out fever. She set a kettle on the small pot-belly stove, and soon the air was thick with the earthy scent of yarrow and comfrey leaves steeping in hot water. "Hold him steady," she told Mabel. She cleaned the wound first, her touch gentle but firm. The man groaned, a low rumble in his chest, but didn't wake. Then came the part she dreaded. She took the bottle of corn liquor they kept for emergencies and poured a generous amount onto a clean rag. The sharp, raw smell filled the stall. "This is going to be loud," she warned. She pressed the soaked rag to the wound. The man arched off the straw, a strangled cry torn from his throat, his body rigid with pain. He thrashed for a moment, his good hand flailing, before slumping back into unconsciousness. His face was pale, beaded with sweat. Eliza worked fast, packing the wound with the mashed herbs and binding it tightly with strips of clean cotton torn from an old shirt. "There," she breathed, sitting back on her heels. "That's all I can do until Doc gets here." Mabel was patting down his coat. Nothing in his pockets but dust and a receipt for horse feed. "But look at this." She pointed to a small, circular brand stamped into the leather of the duster's inner lining, an A, intertwined with a C, under the words Ashford Cattle and Freight. The name was known all the way from Cheyenne to Salt Lake City. Ashford ran one of the biggest cattle operations in the territory. This wasn't some drifter. This was Cole Ashford himself, or someone high up in his company. Tucked into an inside pocket was a folded, crumpled letter. Eliza took it with hesitant fingers. It felt wrong to pry, but the man was bleeding in her barn, and she had a right to know what kind of storm had just blown onto her land. The letterhead was from Silas Rook's office. The writing was sharp and angry, the words practically cutting into the paper. "Mr. Ashford," it began, "your refusal to sign the revised water access agreement is not only bad for business, it is an insult to the progress this valley is making. The railroad requires land, and the water rights will be consolidated, with or without your consent. Reconsider your position, or you may find the territory a far less hospitable place for your enterprise." Eliza read it twice, the meaning settling in her stomach like a cold stone. Cole Ashford had stood up to Rook, and Rook had answered with a bullet. "So that's it," Mabel said softly, her usual humor gone. "He's the reason Rook's been smiling like a fox in a henhouse. He thought he had all the big players on his side." A sudden noise from outside made them both freeze. It was the jingle of harness and the low murmur of voices. Eliza peered through a crack in the barn wall. 2 men on horseback were sitting by the fence line, the very section she had just repaired. They were rough-looking men, the kind who found work with bullies like Rook. She recognized one of them, a man they called Mac, known for a temper as short as his stirrups. "Howdy, ma'am," Mac called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. He wasn't looking at the house, but at the barn. "Heard some commotion over here this morning. Everything all right?" Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked at Mabel, then at the unconscious man on the straw. Lying was not in her nature, but telling the truth felt like signing a death warrant for him. And maybe for them. Mac's partner squinted, his eyes scanning the property. "We're just looking for a fella. Rode out of town last night in a hurry. Big fella, on a chestnut, might have been hurt." The lie came easier than she thought it would. Just a few stray cattle breaking the fence. Eliza called back, her voice remarkably steady. "Nothing more." The men sat there for a long moment, their silence a heavy blanket. Eliza could feel their suspicion, a palpable thing reaching across the dusty yard. Finally! Max shrugged and pulled on his reins. Well, you see anyone like that, he said, his gaze lingering on the barn door. You be sure to let Sheriff Brody know. Mr. Rook is very concerned. They wheeled their horses and trotted away, leaving a cloud of red dust hanging in the air. Eliza let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had made her choice by the fence. But now, standing in the dim light of the barn with a wounded man and a dangerous secret, she understood the cost. She hadn't just saved a stranger. She had invited his war into her home. Night fell like a dropped curtain, bringing a cold that seeped through the cracks in the cabin walls. Cole Ashford drifted in and out of a fevered consciousness. In his lucid moments, he was aware of the low murmur of the two women's voices, the scent of hay and herbal poultices, and the relentless throb in his shoulder and leg. The pain was a familiar enemy, but the helplessness was new. He was a man accustomed to giving orders, to riding at the head of his own destiny, lying on a bed of straw, dependent on the kindness of strangers he had endangered, was a special kind of hell. Eliza and Mabel took turns sitting with him, wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth. The day had dragged on without a sign of Doc Finch. Every passing wagon on the distant road was a false alarm, tightening the knot of anxiety in Eliza's chest. They had moved Ashford's horse to a secluded box stall at the back of the barn, hoping it wouldn't be seen. The chestnut was a fine, memorable animal, a beacon that could draw the wrong kind of attention. He's burning up, Mabel whispered, placing a hand on Ashford's forehead. If that bullet stays in him much longer, the infection will take him. Eliza nodded, her gaze fixed on the man's face, tight with pain even in his delirium. Was this her penance for a moment of compassion? The question circled in her mind, relentless as a vulture. She could have fixed the fence, saved herself this trouble, but leaving him to die felt like letting a piece of her own soul wither. Silas Rook wanted to squeeze the life from this valley, to own the dirt, the water, and the will of the people on it. Leaving this man to his fate felt too much like surrender. It was close to midnight when the dogs started barking, a frantic, furious sound that ripped through the quiet. Eliza grabbed the rifle from its place by the door. "Stay here," she told Mabel. She stepped out into the yard, the moonlight casting long, skeletal shadows. The wind had died down, and the silence that followed the dog's barking was more menacing than the noise had been. Then she saw it, a flicker of orange against the dark bulk of the hayrick at the far end of the corral. It wasn't a lantern. It was flame, hungry and alive, licking its way up the dry winter hay. Mabel, fire. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. That hayrick was their cattle's food for the next month, the difference between holding on and selling off for pennies. She ran toward the well, grabbing buckets, but the blaze was growing with terrifying speed, a roaring beast consuming their future. From inside the barn came a sudden, sharp crack, then another, gunshots. The orange glow illuminated two figures near the fire, who froze for a second before scrambling onto their horses and galloping away into the darkness. The immediate threat was gone, but the fire remained. Mabel was already there, throwing a bucket of precious water onto the base of the inferno. It hissed and steamed, a futile gesture against the raging flames. As Eliza ran to join her, a different sound reached her, a sharp ping, followed by the gush of running water. She whirled around. Water was pouring from the side of the big metal cistern next to the barn, their main reservoir, painstakingly filled from the slow-trickling well. In the moonlight, she could see a small, dark hole in its side, a fatal wound. One of the warning shots had gone astray. They watched the hay burn. There was nothing else to do. It went up in a brilliant, terrible tower of flame and smoke, lighting up the valley as if for a celebration. When it was over, and the cistern had bled itself dry onto the thirsty ground, a profound silence descended. All that remained was a pile of smoldering ash and the quiet gurgle of the last of their water soaking into the dirt. Mabel walked over to the cistern and poked a finger into the bullet hole. She looked at the ruin of their hay, then back at the empty tank. "Well," she said, her voice devoid of its usual cheer, "at least they're good shots. Hit the cheapest thing we own." The gallows humor was so unexpected it almost made Eliza laugh, a hysterical sound that caught in her throat. She felt a presence behind them and turned. Cole Ashford stood leaning heavily against the barn door, his face ashen. He held his pistol in his good hand, his knuckles white. The effort of getting upright and firing the gun had clearly cost him. A fresh slick of blood had soaked through the bandage on his shoulder. He coughed, a dry, rasping sound. "I'll replace it," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. He gestured with the pistol toward the ruined cistern, with one twice the size. Eliza looked from the smoldering hay to the bleeding man, and all the fear and frustration of the night boiled over. "Start by not dying in my barn," she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. His eyes, clear and startlingly blue in the faint light, met hers. He didn't flinch from her anger. He simply nodded, a flicker of shame or perhaps just exhaustion crossing his features before he swayed on his feet. They helped him back to the straw, the tension between them a living thing. He had tried to help, but in doing so, had deepened their disaster. He was a man of action whose actions now brought only ruin. He slumped back into his fevered dreams, leaving Eliza and Mabel to stare at the wreckage of their morning's hope. By sunrise, the rumors had already begun to sprout in the thin soil of Red Butte's gossip mill. Word, carried by Rook's men, spread quickly. The Wynn women, that stubborn pair holding onto their father's scrubland, had taken in a gunslinger, an enemy of the valley's progress. The fire was a warning, a sign of the trouble they were courting. The story of the broken cistern was twisted, told as proof of the stranger's recklessness. Doc Finch arrived late the next morning, his buggy kicking up a cloud of dust. He was a stern, whiskered man whose bedside manner was gruff but whose hands were surprisingly gentle. He examined Ashford's wounds with a series of non-committal grunts. "You did well, Eliza," he said, surprising her. "This poultice likely kept the worst of the poison at bay, but this bullet needs to come out. Now." The procedure was brutal and blessedly short. Mabel held Ashford down while Doc Finch probed the wound with a thin, steel instrument. Ashford's muffled screams were terrible to hear. When the doctor finally extracted the flattened piece of lead, he dropped it with a clink into a metal basin. He stitched the wound, applied a strong-smelling salve, and wrapped it in fresh bandages. Then he turned his attention to the leg. "Knee's not broken, but it's a bad sprain and the joint is out of place. He won't be walking on it for weeks, maybe longer." He expertly manipulated the joint until it popped back into its socket with a sickening crunch. He bound it tightly. "Keep it elevated. Cold compresses. And he needs to stay put. Moving him is out of the question." "He can't stay in the barn," Eliza said, her voice low. "Rook's men will be back. They'll be bolder next time." Doc Finch stroked his whiskers, his gaze thoughtful. "Heard the talk in town. Rook is painting this man as a villain and you as his accomplice." He looked from Eliza to the unconscious man. "The Ashford name carries weight, but out here, Rook's word is law for now." An idea, born of desperation, took shape in Eliza's mind. The root cellar. Mabel looked at her, then nodded slowly. "It's cool and out of sight." The cellar was a small, stone-lined room beneath the kitchen floor, accessed by a trapdoor hidden under a rag rug. It was where they stored potatoes, carrots, and preserves. A cool, dark sanctuary from the summer heat. It was also defensible. It took all their strength, along with the doctor's, to move Ashford. They half carried him into the house and lowered him carefully into the cellar, making a pallet for him on the packed earth floor. The air was cool and smelled of damp soil and apples. "Here," Doc Finch said, handing Eliza a small bottle of laudanum. A few drops for the pain if it gets too bad. Not too much. And keep forcing broth and water into him. His life is in your hands now, girl. More than it's in mine. He gave her a detailed list of instructions how often to change the dressings, how to apply pressure to the leg, simple breathing exercises to keep his lungs clear. He was treating her not as a farm girl, but as a colleague. When the doctor had gone, promising to return in 2 days with more supplies, a heavy quiet settled over the house. The trapdoor was closed, the rug replaced. To any visitor, the house would seem empty, occupied only by 2 women struggling to survive, but beneath their feet, a war was being waged in the body of a single man, and Eliza was its sole commander. She sat at the kitchen table, the silence pressing in. Saving Cole. Ashford had felt like a simple act of humanity. Now, it felt like a declaration of war. She was no longer just tending a wounded man. She was hiding a fugitive, defying the most powerful man in the valley. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, something else was stirring a stubborn, defiant spark. Rook thought he could break her with fire and fear. He thought he could drain her hope just like he drained her cistern. She looked at the trapdoor, and a new resolve hardened within her. The old boundaries of her life had been shattered. Perhaps it was time to build new ones. The root cellar became its own world, a small, dark universe governed by the rhythm of fever and the slow drip of time. Days bled into nights, marked only by the slant of light that fell through the kitchen floorboards when Eliza lifted the trap door. Down in the cool, earthy dark, the world shrank to the dimensions of a straw pallet, the scent of dust and apples, and the labored breathing of the man entrusted to her care. Cole Ashford's fever was a stubborn, clinging thing. It slicked his skin with a salty sweat and dragged him into muttered, disjointed memories of snow-choked passes and stampeding cattle. Eliza learned the geography of his pain, the sharp intake of breath when she cleaned the weeping wound on his shoulder, the low groan when she adjusted the binding on his swollen knee. She worked with a methodical focus, her hands becoming extensions of her will. She brewed teas from licorice root to soothe his throat and bathed his face and chest with cool water, fighting the heat that threatened to consume him from within. There was an intimacy in the work that was both profound and impersonal. She learned the shape of him, the hard lines of muscle under his skin, the rasp of his beard against her knuckles. She heard the hoarse vulnerability in his voice when he called for water in the dead of night. It was the kind of closeness a person might share with a newborn calf or a dying animal, a connection forged in pure animal need. Yet this was a man, and the air in the small space grew thick with his presence, his struggle, his sheer, stubborn will to live. Mabel was her link to the world above, bringing down bowls of thin broth and fresh bandages. She'd offer quiet reports, her voice a low whisper. Rook's men had been seen in town, buying rounds of drinks and talking loudly about the need to clear out squatters who harbored criminals. The story of the fire had solidified. With the Wynn women cast as foolish and defiant, they were being isolated, a social quarantine that was as effective as any fence. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. Eliza was dozing in a chair she'd brought down, her head slumped against the cool stone wall, when a voice, clearer than any she had heard from him before, cut through the silence. "If you're an angel, you've been neglecting your wings." Her eyes snapped open. Cole was looking at her, his gaze lucid for the first time. The fever had receded, leaving his blue eyes startlingly clear in his pale, drawn face. He tried to push himself up on his good elbow and winced. "Don't move," she said, her voice rough with sleep. She went to him, placing a hand gently on his uninjured shoulder. "You'll tear the stitches." He relaxed back onto the pallet, studying her in the dim lantern light. His eyes took in her rolled-up sleeves, the smudge of dirt on her cheek, the wayward strands of hair that had escaped her braid. A faint smile touched his lips. "I always pictured angels with wings, not rolled-up sleeves and dirt under their fingernails." The words were spoken with a dry wit that caught her off guard. A spark of his true self, finally breaking through the fog of pain. She found herself smiling back, a tired but genuine expression. "Country angels only come with soup ladles and sewing needles," she replied, her tone matching his. "Now, can you drink some broth?" He managed half the bowl, with her supporting his head. The simple act felt monumental. When he was done, he lay back, his breathing easier than it had been in days. The silence stretched between them, no longer filled with the static of fever, but with a quiet, waiting curiosity. "Why?" he asked, his voice low. "Why what? Why are you doing this?" "Helping me. Rook has this valley in his pocket. You've put yourself and your aunt in his sights. For a stranger." Eliza thought for a moment, arranging the empty bowl and spoon on a nearby crate. "My father used to say that you don't measure a person by who their friends are, but by who their enemies are. Mr. Rook seems to be an enemy worth having." She looked at him directly. "And you were hurt on my land. That makes you my responsibility." He seemed to consider this, his gaze drifting to the rough-hewn ceiling. The lantern light flickered, making the shadows dance. "Responsibility is a heavy stone to carry." His voice grew distant, and his eyes unfocused as a memory pulled him under. He was in Wyoming, 2 years back. The cold was a physical thing, a creature with teeth that bit through leather and wool. They were driving 2,000 heads south before the first big snow. But the blizzard came early, a white wall that descended from the mountains without warning. The world vanished into a screaming vortex of wind and ice. The cattle, terrified, turned their backs to the wind and began to drift, a slow-motion stampede into oblivion. He and his men rode with them, their faces masked with ice, their hands frozen into claws around the reins. They lost 3 men that first night, swallowed by the whiteout. For days, they lived in the saddle, chewing on frozen jerky, their only warmth the fading heat of their horses. He remembered the feeling of utter helplessness, of being a tiny, insignificant speck pitted against the vast, indifferent power of nature. It wasn't a battle you could win with a gun or with money. You won by enduring. You won by refusing to die. He came back to the present with a slight shiver, the phantom cold still clinging to him. Eliza was watching him, her expression unreadable. "You looked a long way off," she said softly. "Just an old ghost," he replied, shifting to ease the pressure on his leg, a reminder that there are things worse than Silas Rook. Over the next few days, as his strength slowly returned, he began to talk. He told her about his family back east, a name synonymous with railroads and banking, a legacy of ruthless ambition he had tried to escape by building something of his own out west. He had wanted his name, the Ashford name, to stand for something solid, something built with sweat and grit, not just clever contracts and broken promises. "That's what this fight with Rook is about," he explained one afternoon. "The light from above striping the cellar in dusty gold. It's not just about my freight contracts." He pushed himself up, leaning against the cool stone wall, his voice gaining strength. "Rook is using the railroad as a lever. He's creating these new water tariffs, making it impossible for the small ranchers to afford to irrigate. He drives them to the brink, forces them to sell their land and their water rights to him for next to nothing." Eliza listened, her hands busy mending a tear in one of his shirts, the needle moving in a steady, rhythmic pattern. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture that was uglier than she had imagined. "Once he has all the land," Cole continued, his voice tight with anger, "he plans to sell the entire consolidated parcel to the Union Pacific for their new expansion line. He's not just grabbing land, he's stealing the future of this entire valley and selling it to the highest bidder. My freight company was the last major holdout. If I signed his agreement, it would have legitimized his whole scheme." So that was the shape of the monster. Not just a bully, but a calculating thief, using the law as his weapon. The knowledge settled heavily in the small room. The fight was bigger than her farm, bigger than Cole Ashford's company. It was for the soul of Red Butte. Her work on him continued. She changed his bandages, the white strips of cotton a stark contrast to his sun-darkened skin. One evening, as she finished wrapping his shoulder, A sliver of moonlight found its way through a crack in the floorboards above, landing directly on the clean, white bandage. It looked impossibly pure in the dusty cellar, a small, clean promise in the midst of all the dirt and pain. It felt like hope. She realized then that something had shifted between them. The careful distance of nurse and patient had eroded, worn away by shared secrets and whispered conversations in the dark. She was no longer just tending to a stranger. She was caring for Cole. And that care had become its own quiet act of defiance, a courage that didn't require a rifle or a loud voice. It was the simple, steady courage of showing up, of applying a poultice, of offering a bowl of soup. It was a love born not of romance, but of action, a bond forged in the cool, dark earth beneath a troubled land. She was just a farm girl, nursing an injured man, with no thought to what might come after. And in that simple, profound act, she had found her footing for the fight to come. The sky began to change in the late afternoon. The brilliant, unforgiving blue of the Utah sky slowly curdled, taking on a bruised, yellowish hue at the western horizon. The wind, a constant companion in the valley, picked up a new voice, a low, mournful howl that rattled the window panes and sent dust devils skittering across the parched yard. Mabel stood on the porch, a hand shielding her eyes as she looked toward the mountains, the skies threatening like a preacher before collection. She remarked, her voice dry as the air. More talk than action. Cole, who had graduated from the cellar to a chair by the hearth, watched her from the doorway. He could now move with the aid of a crudely fashioned crutch. Though every step sent a jolt of fire through his knee, the days in the dark had sharpened his senses. He could feel the pressure dropping, could smell the metallic tang of the dust on the rising wind. I wouldn't be too sure about that. Ma'am, he said quietly, this feels different. As if on cue, a furious gust of wind slammed into the house, shaking it to its foundations. A loose piece of corrugated iron on the barn roof began to clang a frantic, metallic rhythm. Mabel grabbed the door frame to steady herself. I take it back, she muttered, retreating inside. The storm hit not as a squall, but as a solid wall of red dust. The world outside the cabin dissolved into a roaring, ochre-tinted chaos. Visibility dropped to near zero. It was like being inside a drum. The wind, a relentless, thundering beat against the wooden walls. For an hour, they could do nothing but wait, listening to the storm try to claw its way inside. When the wind finally began to abate, its roar lessening to a weary moan, the silence it left behind was unnerving. Eliza was the first one out the door. The aftermath was a scene of quiet devastation. A thick blanket of fine red sand covered everything, smoothing the sharp edges of the world into soft, alien dunes. But the real damage was at the corral, a whole section of the fence. The same one the cattle had tested that first morning had been torn from its posts and lay half buried in the sand. The herd was gone. Panic, sharp and cold, seized Eliza. She ran toward the broken fence, her boots sinking in the soft, freshly deposited dust. Cole followed as quickly as he could, his crutch plunging deep with every step, his face set in a grim line. They won't have gone far, he said, his voice a low reassurance against the whistling wind. They'll drift with the storm, but they'll try to find shelter. They found most of the herd huddled in the lee of a rocky outcropping a quarter-mile from the farm. But as Eliza did a quick, desperate count, her heart sank. A mother cow was bawling pitifully, circling the edge of a deep, sand-choked arroyo. Her calf was missing. Eliza slid down the steep, sandy bank of the dry wash. At the bottom, trapped in the narrow channel, was the calf. It was small and weak, its legs tangled, bleeding in terror. It had tried to scramble out, but the sandy walls gave way with every attempt. I'll get my rope, she called up to Cole. No time, he answered, already making his way down the treacherous slope, ignoring the protest of his injured leg. The mother's frantic. She'll bolt if we spook her. He reached the bottom, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his face pale with pain. He knelt by the calf, murmuring to it in a low, calming voice. The small animal, exhausted and frightened, quieted under his touch. "All right, little one," he said softly. "Let's get you home." He braced himself, his jaw tight. Then, with a grunt of pure effort, he scooped the calf into his arms. It was a dead weight of about 70 pounds, and the strain on his wounded shoulder and unstable knee was immense. Eliza saw his face go white, a sheen of sweat instantly breaking out on his forehead. "Cole, you can't," she protested, "moving to help him. Your leg." "I can," he bit out, his voice strained. "Just clear the way." The climb back up the arroyo wall was an agony to watch. Cole used his good shoulder to push against the bank, his booted feet digging for purchase in the shifting sand. The calf struggled weakly in his arms. Twice he slipped, his injured leg giving way, and each time Eliza thought he would fall. But he caught himself, his knuckles scraping raw against the rock, and pushed upward again, driven by a force that had nothing to do with physical strength. He was a man refusing to be broken, by Rook, by a blizzard, or by his own damaged body. When he finally crested the top and gently lowered the calf to the ground, he collapsed against the rocks, his chest heaving, his eyes squeezed shut against the white-hot waves of pain. The mother cow rushed to her calf, nudging it with her nose, her frantic cries softening to low, contented moans. Eliza knelt beside him, her own heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a startling, fierce admiration. "That was the most foolish, stubborn thing I have ever seen," she said, her voice shaking slightly. He opened his eyes, and a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You should see me on a good day." As they guided the pair back toward the rest of the herd, Eliza spotted something glinting in the sand. It was a small brass bell, the one that had belonged to the calf. The leather strap had broken in its fall. She picked it up, the metal cool in her hand. Later, back in the relative safety of the barn, after Cole had slumped into a chair, exhausted and spent, she found a new strip of leather and carefully refastened the bell around the calf's neck. The small, clear chime as it shook its head was the sound of a small victory, a single, hopeful note in a world that had gone quiet and menacing. It was the sound of tying her faith back to the living, breathing world. The sandstorm had stirred up more than dust. Mabel returned from a trip to town 2 days later, her face grim. She tacked a freshly printed notice to the cabin wall. It announced a public auction to be held at the town hall in 1 week's time. Several properties, their owners delinquent on banknotes and unable to pay Rook's new water tariffs, were to be sold. To welcome new investors from Salt Lake City, the notice read, "Who see the bright future of Red Butte?" The sheriff's signature was at the bottom. "It's a land grab, plain and simple," Mabel said, her voice sharp with anger. "Rook's not even pretending anymore." Eliza read the names of the families on the list. They were their neighbors, people who had been in this valley for a generation. Her own family's name wasn't on it. Not yet, but she knew it was only a matter of time. The weight of their own banknote felt crushing. She knew then she could no longer just hide and hope. She had to fight back, trusting Cole to keep watch over the farm. A silent acknowledgement of their changed partnership. She saddled her mare the next morning and rode for town. Her first stop was Doc Finch's office. He listened quietly as she told him about the auction notice. His expression grew more thunderous with every word. When she was finished, he slammed a medical text shut. "It's theft by fountain pen, but proving it is another matter. Rook has the law on his side because he bought the lawmakers." As they spoke, the door opened and Deputy Jonah Pike stepped inside, his hat in his hands. The young deputy looked as if he hadn't slept in a week, his face pale and his eyes darting nervously toward the street. "Ma'am, doctor," he stammered. I can't be here long." He looked at Eliza, his expression a mixture of fear and resolve. "The things they're saying about you, it ain't right. None of this is—" He reached into his coat and pulled out a slim, leather-bound ledger. This is Rook's private account book. He keeps it in the sheriff's safe. I made a copy of a few pages." He slid the folded papers across the desk to Eliza. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened them. It was a meticulous record of corruption payments to Sheriff Brody, notations of fraudulent water flow measurements from the streams that fed the valley, and a list of investors that included the name of the bank president who held all their notes.
"Jonah, you know what they'll do if they find out you did this,"
Doc Finch said, his voice a low warning. "I know," the young man said, his jaw set. "But my father settled in this valley. He didn't raise me to stand by and watch a man like Rook steal it." He backed toward the door.
"Be careful, ma'am. That's all the proof you need. But it's also enough to get you buried."
And then he was gone. Eliza stared at the pages, her heart hammering. This was it, the weapon she needed. Now what, she asked, looking at the doctor. Doc Finch stroked his whiskers. "Now, we need to load the gun, and for that, you need Nora Bell." Nora's Cafe and Mercantile was the nerve center of Red Butte. Nora herself, a woman with shrewd eyes and hair pinned up in a severe bun, missed nothing. She served coffee and gossip in equal measure, and her opinion could sway the town faster than a flash flood. Eliza found her wiping down the long wooden counter. She slid the ledger pages in front of her without a word. Nora cleaned her hands on her apron, picked up the papers, and began to read. Her expression didn't change, but a muscle tightened in her jaw. She read them twice, then folded them neatly and handed them back to Eliza.
"This is dynamite,"
Nora said, her voice low.
"But dynamite can blow up in your own hands if you're not careful. What do you want me to do?"
"When the time is right," Eliza said, her own voice gaining a confidence she hadn't known she possessed. "I need you to make sure everyone in this valley sees this." Nora Bell looked at the young woman before her, seeing not a frightened farm girl, but a fighter. A slow, calculating smile spread across her face.
"Honey,"
she said, leaning forward, "you bring the match. I'll make sure the whole town feels the heat." Riding home, with the damning papers tucked safely inside her coat, Eliza felt a profound shift within herself. She was no longer just a victim of circumstance, waiting for the next blow to fall. She had allies. She had evidence. She had a plan. The wind that pushed against her felt less like an enemy and more like a challenge. She was no longer just protecting her small piece of land. She was fighting for the heart of the valley itself. Saturday was market day in Red Butte, a weekly ritual that usually brought a welcome break from the isolation of the farm. It was a chance to trade for supplies, catch up on news, and feel a part of a community. But as Eliza rode into town, the ledger pages tucked securely in an inside pocket, she felt none of the usual anticipation. The air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. She saw it almost immediately. Nailed to the public notice board outside Nora Bell's Mercantile was a freshly printed flyer, stark black ink on cheap white paper. Several were tacked up and down the main street, fluttering in the breeze like captured birds. Her stomach tightened into a cold knot even before she was close enough to read the words. A small crowd was gathered by the board, reading and muttering amongst themselves. When they saw her approaching, the conversation died. A few men tipped their hats, but their eyes were guarded. Others simply turned their backs. The warmth she usually found in this town had been replaced by a chilling suspicion. She dismounted and pushed her way to the front, her heart pounding a heavy, slow rhythm. The headline was large and bold: "Ashford Freight Concedes to Valley Progress." The text below was a masterpiece of calculated lies. It claimed that after careful consideration for the future prosperity of Red Butte, Cole Ashford's company had agreed to sell its controlling interest in the local freight lines and transfer all associated water rights to Silas Rook's development syndicate. It spoke of a new era of cooperation, a partnership that would bring the full power of the railroad to the valley. At the bottom was a crude reproduction of the Ashford Cattle and Freight Company seal, stamped next to a forged signature. It was just convincing enough to be believed by those who wanted to believe it. A wave of fury, hot and sickening, washed over Eliza. This was Rook's counterattack, a public execution of Cole's reputation. He wasn't just making Cole a villain. He was making him a traitor, a rich Easterner who had cut a backroom deal and sold them all out. See there, a man grumbled to his neighbor, loud enough for Eliza to hear. Knew he was no different. They all look out for their own kind. Eliza turned and met his gaze, her own eyes blazing. The man, a rancher named Peterson, whose land bordered hers, had the decency to look away, shuffling his feet in the dust. She saw Nora Bell standing in the doorway of her mercantile, her arms crossed, her expression like granite. Their eyes met for a brief second, a silent exchange of shared outrage. She didn't stay long. The whispers and cold stares followed her as she bought the few supplies she needed and rode out of town. The ride home was a blur of anger. The ledger pages in her pocket felt useless against a lie so brazen, so public. Rook wasn't playing by the rules of evidence. He was playing by the rules of power. She found Cole in the barn, attempting to mend a piece of harness. He was slow and clumsy with one good hand, but the focused work seemed to calm the restlessness that came with his forced inaction. He looked up as she entered, and the hope in his eyes died when he saw her face. "What is it?" he asked, putting the leather aside. She handed him the flyer without a word. He read it, his expression hardening with each line. When he was finished, the paper was crumpled in his fist. He slammed his hand against a wooden post, a sharp, violent sound that made the horses in their stalls startle. He let out a string of curses, low and vicious. He forged my name, my company seal. He looked at Eliza, his blue eyes dark with a helpless rage. He's telling them I sold them out, that I'm just like... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. Just like who, Eliza asked softly. He turned away, limping to the far end of the barn, staring out the open doors at the unforgiving landscape. "My father," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "My father built an empire on deals like this. He'd buy out a man's life's work for pennies on the dollar, call it progress, and sleep like a baby. I came out here to build something clean, something that was mine, and now Rook is painting me with the same brush." He laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "Maybe he's right. Maybe it's in the blood." "That's foolish talk, and you know it," Eliza said sharply, walking over to him. "You are not your father. You stood up to Rook, and that's why you were shot. This flyer is the act of a desperate man who fears the truth." "The truth doesn't matter if no one believes it," he shot back, his frustration turning on her. "I have to go into town. I have to face them. Tell them this is a lie." "You can't," she insisted. "You can barely walk to the barn, let alone ride to town and face down Rook's men. It's a trap. Cole, he wants you to show your face. He wants you to be angry and reckless. So I'm supposed to hide in your cellar while he destroys my name?" The accusation in his voice stung. "I won't be a coward." "It is not cowardice to be smart," she argued, her own temper rising. "We have the ledger. We have proof. We have a plan." "The plan just got shot to pieces," he said, gesturing with the crumpled flyer. "Right now, I'm the villain in this story. No one will listen to a word I say or a word you say on my behalf." They stood in a tense standoff, the space between them charged with his wounded pride and her fierce, protective pragmatism. It was Mabel who broke the silence, appearing in the doorway with a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "If you two are finished trying to out-stubborn each other," she said tartly, "you might want to decide what you're actually going to do. Because that boy, Deputy Pike, just rode by. Said the sheriff gave him a public dressing down for dereliction of duty. Rook's tightening the leash on everyone." That settled it. Jonah was in trouble because of them. Cole's face was set like stone. "I'm going." Eliza saw the unbending will in his eyes and knew it was useless to argue. If he went alone, Rook's men would finish what they started. "Then I'm going with you," she said, her voice firm. He started to object, but she cut him off. "I know the back ways, and you'll need someone to hold your horse when you fall off." Mabel handed Eliza the bundle. "If you're determined to ride into a hornet's nest, you may as well take something to stir them up." Inside the cloth were 2 of the smoke flares she used to scare coyotes away from the chickens. They were thick, wax-sealed tubes of paper and chemicals, just in case. The ride was tense and mostly silent. They avoided the main road, taking a winding trail that cut through a narrow canyon of red rock. The high stone walls amplified the sound of their horses' hooves and cast long, cool shadows, offering a respite from the afternoon sun. But the enclosed space also felt claustrophobic, like a trap waiting to be sprung. They came around a sharp bend in the trail and found their way blocked. Mac Crow Delaney and another of Rook's thugs were waiting for them, sitting lazily on their horses. A smug, predatory grin spread across Mac's face. "Well, look what we have here," he drawled, his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. "The ghost of Ashford Freight himself. Heard you were leaving the valley. Just wanted to wish you a fond farewell." "Get out of my way, Mac," Cole said, his voice low and even, but Eliza could see the muscles in his jaw bunching. "Now, is that any way to talk to the welcoming committee?" Mac chuckled. He and his partner slowly began to advance, fanning out to cut off any retreat. "Mr. Rook just wants a word. He feels your business arrangement was left unresolved." Cole knew what was coming. He reached for his own pistol, but he was slower than them, hampered by his injuries. Mac's gun was out of its holster in a flash. "I wouldn't," he said, the humor gone from his voice. Everything happened at once. Cole, ignoring the warning, spurred his horse forward, trying to break through the closing gap. As his horse lunged, his injured leg gave way in the stirrup, and he cried out, his balance failing. Seeing his chance, Mac's partner drew his weapon and took aim. There was no time to think. Eliza's rifle was in her hands, the stock pressed against her shoulder. She didn't aim at either man. She fired into the rock wall just above Mac's head. The report of the rifle was deafening in the narrow canyon, and rock chips sprayed down, stinging his face. The horses screamed and reared in terror. In that split second of chaos, Eliza remembered the bundle from Mabel. With her free hand, she ripped one of the smoke flares from her saddlebag, struck the friction tape end against her saddle horn, and threw it. It landed on the ground between the horses, sputtering for a moment before erupting in a huge, dense cloud of foul-smelling, choking white smoke. The canyon filled instantly with a blinding, disorienting fog. Men and horses alike coughed and panicked. "Go," Eliza screamed. Grabbing the reins of Cole's terrified horse, she wheeled her own mount and dug her heels in, dragging his horse with her, plunging back the way they had come. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of confused shouting and panicked whinnying, muffled by the thick smoke. They didn't stop until they were miles away, hidden in a thicket of juniper trees, their horses trembling and lathered. Cole slumped forward in his saddle, his face gray with pain and exhaustion. He slid to the ground, his bad leg collapsing under him. Eliza was beside him in an instant, her own adrenaline-fueled strength giving way to a wave of trembling relief. They were alive. They were safe. For the moment. He lay on the ground, breathing heavily, his eyes closed. "Thank you." He managed to get out, his voice a hoarse rasp. After a long moment, he opened his eyes and looked up at her, a wry, pained smile on his face. "If I die," he said, his voice barely audible, "do me a favor, don't let them write rich on my tombstone." Eliza looked down at this man, stubborn, proud, and bleeding in the dirt for a cause he believed in. The fear and anger she had felt all day melted away, replaced by a fierce, unexpected wave of affection. "Don't worry," she said, her own smile finding its way through the grime and tension. "I'll write hard-headed. Died because he wouldn't lie still." The ambush in the canyon solidified their resolve into something hard and sharp. They returned to the farm under the cover of dusk, not defeated, but forged in a new, shared purpose. Cole's leg was a torment, the day's ride having undone weeks of careful healing, but the fire in his eyes burned brighter than the pain. The shame he'd felt over his family's name had been burned away, replaced by the cold fury of a man whose own name had been stolen and defiled. He was no longer fighting a legacy. He was fighting for his own honor. That night, the cabin became a war room. The flickering lantern light cast long, dancing shadows on the walls as their small band of conspirators gathered around the kitchen table. Doc Finch had arrived just after them, his face a grim mask. Nora Bell closed her mercantile early and rode out on a borrowed mule. A heavy woolen shawl pulled tight against the night chill. Deputy Jonah Pike came last, slipping through the darkness like a ghost, his presence a testament to his courage. On the table between them lay the evidence. A small arsenal of paper and ink. There were the copied pages from Rook's ledger. A map of the valley drawn by Eliza's father years ago showing the true flow of the streams, and the forged flyer that had nearly cost Cole his life. "Good news sells for half price," Nora said, tapping a finger on the flyer. "Bad news sells the whole town. Rook has sold them a story of betrayal. We need a better story." "We have a better story," Eliza countered, her voice low but steady. "We have the truth." Mabel, pouring coffee from a dented pot, gave a dry chuckle. "Then we shall sell the truth," she said, her eyes glinting. "It's as dear as gold, and twice as hard to dig up." They laid their plans. Doc Finch confirmed that the circuit judge, a stern but fair man named Elias Thorne, was in the county and scheduled to pass through Red Butte on the day of the auction. His presence was their only hope for an impartial hearing. Jonah explained the finer points of territorial law, the legal levers they could pull if they could just get a formal audience. It was Nora. However, who crafted the strategy? "We can't stop the auction," she said, her gaze moving from face to face. "Rook controls the sheriff and the bank, but we can turn it into a trial. We do it in public, right in the town square. We present our evidence not to the sheriff, but to the people, and to Judge Thorne." The night before the auction was sleepless. The plan was set, but it was a fragile thing, a house of cards built on the courage of a few against the power of many. Just before dawn, Cole and Eliza stood on the porch, watching the first pale light touch the peaks of the Wasatch. The silence between them was no longer tense, but filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. He leaned on his crutch, his face drawn with fatigue and pain, but his shoulders were square. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. "Putting yourself in front of them all." "Are you?" she countered, meeting his gaze. He gave a slow nod. "My name is on that flyer. It's my fight." "My home is on his list," she replied simply. "It's my fight, too." Their journey to town was a silent procession under a sliver of a broken moon. They traveled through a dry wash, the horses' hooves making soft, crunching sounds on the gravel. From the distant hills, the lonely howl of a coyote drifted on the cold air, a wild and mournful sound that seemed to echo the tension in their own hearts. The weight of what they were about to do settled on them, as heavy as a winter saddle. Red Butte's town square was already crowded when they arrived. Rook had set up a makeshift platform in front of the town hall, and he stood upon it, dressed in a smart suit, exuding an air of magnanimous authority. Sheriff Brody stood beside him, his hand resting on his pistol, his face flushed and self-important. Mac Delaney and a half-dozen of Rook's other men were positioned in the crowd, their presence a clear message of intimidation. The ranchers whose lands were on the auction block stood in a miserable, defeated cluster to one side. Their neighbors watched on, a mixture of pity, fear, and morbid curiosity on their faces. A few well-dressed men, the investors from Salt Lake City, stood near the platform, looking pleased. Rook began to speak, his voice smooth and confident, painting a picture of a prosperous future, a valley united by the railroad and freed from the backwards ways of the past. He was in the middle of describing the first parcel of land when Eliza urged her horse forward. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. She rode slowly into the open space before the platform, the crowd parting before her. Cole was right beside her, his face a grim mask of determination. Doc Finch, Nora, and Mabel followed. A small island of defiance in a sea of uncertainty. "Mr. Rook," Eliza said, her voice clear and carrying in the sudden silence. "You speak of the future of this valley, but it seems your plans are based on a faulty map." Rook's smile faltered. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "Miss Wynne, this is a private business proceeding. If you have a grievance, you can file it with the sheriff." "My grievance is with the truth," Eliza said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, meeting the eyes of her neighbors. "And I think it's a public matter." She held up the old, hand-drawn map. "This is a map of the Red Butte water table, drawn by the first surveyor in this valley. It shows the streams as they truly are, not as your paid surveyors have recorded them." A murmur went through the crowd. This was an open challenge, more direct than anyone had expected. Rook's face darkened with fury. He dropped the pretense of civility. "That is a worthless piece of paper. This is a legal auction." He turned to his man. "Mac, relieve the lady of her document." Mac Delaney started forward, a nasty grin spreading across his face. He moved with a swagger, clearly enjoying the chance to assert his power. The crowd shrank back, no one willing to intervene. Cole moved to block his path. He was clumsy on his crutch, and his injured leg dragged behind him. But he placed himself squarely between Mac and Eliza. He didn't have a weapon in his hand, but his presence was a shield, an unyielding statement. "You'll have to come through me," he said, his voice a low growl. Mac laughed. "That won't be hard." He shoved Cole's shoulder. The push was all it took. Cole, off balance, stumbled backward. The crutch slipped from his grasp. As he fell, a scuffle erupted. Doc Finch surged forward to help Cole, only to be shoved back by another of Rook's men. A fist flew. The crowd erupted into a confused, shouting mess. Mac, his objective clear, lunged for Eliza and the map. "That's enough." The voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack. Deputy Jonah Pike stood on the steps of the town hall, his pistol drawn and leveled not at the crowd, but squarely at Mac Delaney. His face was pale, but his hand was steady. "Delaney," Jonas said, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "You're under arrest for assault." Mac froze, his hand inches from Eliza's arm. He stared at Jonah in disbelief, then laughed. "You can't be serious, kid. The sheriff's right there." Sheriff Brody, flustered by the turn of events, puffed out his chest. "Pike, put that weapon away. You're interfering with official business." Jonah's gaze didn't waver. "This man just assaulted another in my presence. That's my business. Under the laws of this territory, I am placing him in custody." The crowd fell silent, a collective gasp hanging in the air. The deputy had just openly defied the sheriff. People began to take sides, some shouting their support for Jonah, others yelling for him to stand down. The square had become a powder keg, as if the heavens themselves were rendering judgment. The sky, which had been growing steadily darker, opened up. It didn't rain, it hailed. Small, hard pellets of ice began to rain down, stinging faces and clattering on the rooftops. People cried out in surprise, shielding their heads. The moment was shattered, the tension broken by the sudden, violent intervention of the weather. Through the chaos, a new figure emerged. A tall, black-clad man with a stern, hawkish face stepped onto the platform. It was Judge Elias Thorne. "Sheriff," the judge said, his voice a deep baritone that commanded immediate attention. "Deputy, holster your weapons." He looked out over the divided, hail-lashed crowd, his eyes missing nothing. "It appears Red Butte has some legal matters that require adjudication, not auctioneering." His gaze settled on Rook, then on Eliza. "I am convening a formal public hearing, tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock, in the town hall. All claims and evidence will be presented then." His word was final. The auction was over. Rook's face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He stared at Eliza, his eyes promising retribution. As the crowd began to disperse, seeking shelter from the hail, he leaned down from the platform, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for her. "Enjoy your victory, farm girl," he hissed. "Your homestead won't be standing to see the sunrise." Rook's threat hung in the air, more chilling than the hail that had scattered the crowd. The ride back to the farm was a grim, silent journey. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking figure. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered menace. They did not go to the cabin. Instead, they led the horses directly into the barn, a fortress that felt horribly exposed. There would be no sleep this night. They were a garrison under siege, waiting for an attack they knew was coming. Mabel was a general preparing her defenses. She filled every bucket, pail, and pot with water from the well, a slow, back-breaking task that created a pathetic-looking line of defense against the threat of arson. Cole, his face a tight mask of pain, checked and reloaded his pistol and Eliza's rifle. He stationed himself by a crack in the barn wall that offered a view of the long track leading to the farm. His crutch lay beside him. He had propped himself up on a stack of hay bales, a wounded sentinel. Eliza moved through the motions of caring for the livestock, her movements automatic. She spoke to the animals in low, soothing tones, her own fear a sharp, metallic taste in her mouth. She was terrified, but a cold, clear anger burned beneath the fear. Rook thought he could burn her out, burn away her history and her future, and leave nothing but ash. He was wrong. A home was more than wood and nails. The attack came hours later, long after the moon had set. It wasn't a subtle, creeping fire. It was an assault. 3 riders thundered into the yard, torches held high, their faces obscured by bandanas. They let out whoops and hollers, the sounds of men drunk on power and malice. One of them threw his torch onto the roof of the small chicken coop, which went up in a whoosh of dry timber and panicked squawking. Another galloped toward the barn, his arm cocked back to throw. Cole's pistol barked once from the darkness of the barn. The rider cried out, not in pain but in surprise, and the torch flew wide, landing harmlessly in the dirt. The riders, momentarily confused by the resistance, pulled back. "They're trying to draw us out," Cole yelled to Eliza. "They want to set fire to the house while we're busy with the barn." As if on cue, the 3rd rider, who had circled around, threw his torch onto the porch of the cabin. The dry wood caught instantly. Mabel Eliza screamed, grabbing 2 of the buckets. The 3 of them ran from the barn, a tiny, desperate fire brigade against the encroaching darkness. Cole, unable to run, provided covering fire, his shots carefully aimed at the ground near the riders' horses, forcing them to keep their distance. The fire on the porch was their first battle. They threw the water, which hissed and steamed, beating back the flames but not extinguishing them. As Mabel ran back to the well for more, Eliza saw a new, more terrible threat. The 1st rider, the one who had missed the barn, had circled around and thrown his torch into the open hayloft. The dry hay ignited with an explosive roar. A column of flame shot through the loft door, painting the entire farm in a hellish, flickering light. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over Eliza. They couldn't fight fires on 2 fronts. The barn and the animals within it were lost. But then a new sound cut through the roar of the flames, the frantic ringing of a bell and the thunder of approaching wagons. A small army was charging down the track toward them. Lanterns swung wildly in the darkness. At the head of the procession was a buckboard driven by Nora Bell, who was whipping the mule with one hand and ringing a large dinner bell with the other. Behind her came a dozen men from the town ranchers, the blacksmith, even old man Peterson, who had turned his back on Eliza that very morning. They were armed, not with guns, but with shovels and buckets and a grim, neighborly resolve. Rook's men, seeing the overwhelming numbers, fired a few parting shots into the air and galloped away into the night, their mission of terror a failure. The townspeople descended on the fires like a disciplined crew. Nora organized a bucket brigade from the well to the house, quickly dousing the flames on the porch. Doc Finch, who had ridden in with the group, directed the men in fighting the more dangerous blaze in the barn. "The main support beams are still good," he yelled over the noise. "Get the animals out first." While the men led the coughing, terrified horses and cattle to the safety of the corral, Eliza saw Jonah Pike stumble out of the smoke, his face smudged with soot, a bloody gash on his forehead. Doc Finch was at his side in an instant, guiding him away from the chaos. "It's just a graze," the doctor said after a quick examination. "Looks like a piece of falling timber caught him. He'll have a headache to match his conscience, but he'll live." Cole had made his way out of the barn and was directing the effort to save it, his voice cutting through the din, a commander finding his authority even while leaning on a crutch. Eliza found herself working alongside him, their earlier arguments forgotten, their movements synchronized in the urgent, desperate dance of survival. They used the long-handled irrigation shovels to pull the burning hay from the loft, creating a firebreak that saved the main structure. Slowly, agonizingly, they won. The roaring inferno was reduced to a smoldering, steaming ruin. The house was saved. The barn was scarred but standing. The animals were safe. As the last of the embers were extinguished, a gentle rain began to fall, a soft, cleansing sound on the hot ashes and scorched wood. The townspeople, their faces black with soot and streaked with sweat, began to pack up their wagons, their work done. They offered quiet words of support, a nod, a hand on the shoulder. They were no longer suspicious onlookers. They were allies. When the last wagon had rolled away, an exhausted peace settled over the farm. Eliza, Cole, and Mabel stood in the yard, surveying the damage in the gray pre-dawn light. The air smelled of wet ash and rain. Cole suddenly shivered, a violent, bone-rattling tremor. The adrenaline that had sustained him was gone, leaving him exposed to the cold, the rain, and the deep, throbbing pain in his leg and shoulder. He swayed, and Eliza moved to steady him, her arm going around his waist. "You're freezing," she said, her voice soft with a concern that went beyond that of a nurse. She led him to the porch, which was charred but intact, and sat him down on a bench. Mabel, with a knowing look, went inside and returned with a heavy wool blanket. Eliza wrapped the blanket around his broad shoulders, tucking it in carefully. He was still shivering, his teeth chattering. Without thinking, she knelt before him and took his hands in hers, chafing them, trying to bring some warmth back into his chilled fingers. His hands were large and calloused, but they trembled in hers like a frightened child's. "It's over," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "We held—" He looked down at her, his face streaked with grime, his eyes reflecting the deep exhaustion and gratitude he couldn't put into words. The rain fell softly around them, a gentle curtain separating them from the world. He was still trembling, acting on an instinct she didn't fully understand. She leaned forward, still holding his hands, and rested her forehead against his. It was a gesture of profound, simple intimacy. His skin was cold, but she could feel the faint tremor of life in him, the shared reality of their survival. They stayed that way for a long moment, breathing in the scent of rain and smoke. Two solitary figures who had found an anchor in each other in the midst of the storm. There were no words, only the silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged between them, a bond tempered in fire and sealed in a moment of quiet grace. The sun was barely up when Nora Bell rode back into a town buzzing with news of the night's events. She didn't go to her mercantile. She went to the small office of the Red Butte Chronicle, woke up the printer, and, using the authority of her position as the paper's biggest advertiser, commissioned a special edition. By 8 o'clock, as people began to gather for the 9 o'clock hearing, they found a new notice plastered on the town hall doors, on the mercantile windows, and on the public notice board. It was a single-sheet newspaper, the ink still fresh. The headline, in large, dramatic type, screamed from the page. "Farm girl nurses the injured rich cowboy, never dreaming he'll make her his beloved bride." and beneath it, in a slightly smaller but no less potent line, "And now they stand with us against the water thieves." The effect was electric. The story transformed the dry, legal conflict into a legend. It was a tale of romance, danger, and heroism. A story of the East meeting the West, of a humble farm girl saving a wounded cattle baron, and of them joining forces to fight for the common man. It was witty, it was audacious, and it was irresistible. People snatched up the papers, reading the short, dramatic account Nora had written, their faces breaking into grins. The narrative had been seized. When Silas Rook arrived at the town hall, expecting to face a cowed and divided populace, he found a throng of people buzzing with excitement. They were laughing and pointing at the news sheets, slapping each other on the back. They weren't a fearful mob. They were an audience, eager for the next act of a play where they already knew who the heroes were. He saw the headline, and his face, for the first time, registered a flicker of pure, unadulterated panic. He had lost the crowd before the trial had even begun. The town hall was packed so tightly that the air itself felt compressed, thick with the sense of wet wool, nervous sweat, and anticipation. Judge Thorne sat at a makeshift bench, his face impassive, a rock of impartiality in a churning sea of local emotion. Silas Rook and his lawyer sat at one table, looking stiff and overly confident, while Eliza, Cole, and Doc Finch sat at another. Jonah Pike stood near the judge, no longer a timid deputy but an officer of the court, his bandaged head a badge of honor. The entire town, it seemed, was crammed into the room, holding copies of Nora's news sheet like programs at a theater. The hearing began, and Judge Thorne proved to be as sharp and direct as his reputation suggested. He called Eliza first. She spoke in a clear, steady voice, laying out the foundation of their case. She presented her father's old map, and Doc Finch, in his testimony, verified its authenticity and explained, with scientific precision, how Rook's surveyors had deliberately remarked the stream beds to divert legal water rights. Then Cole was called, leaning on his crutch. He stood before the town. He did not speak of his injuries or the ambush. He spoke as the president of Ashford Freight. He presented the forged flyer and a telegram from his main office in Cheyenne, confirming that no such deal had ever been made. He explained how the company's seal had been crudely copied, a fact a handwriting expert he had wired for would confirm. He laid out Rook's scheme with cold, business-like clarity, showing how the fraudulent water tariffs were designed to bankrupt the very people Rook claimed to be helping. The final, damning piece of evidence was the copy of Rook's ledger. Jonah Pike testified to how he had found it, his voice shaking slightly but never breaking. As Judge Thorne read the entries aloud, the bribes to Sheriff Brody, the payments to Mac Delaney for enforcement, the hidden accounts, a low, angry growl rumbled through the assembled crowd. Sheriff Brody, sitting in the front row, turned a shade of purple that clashed horribly with his uniform. Rook's lawyer blustered and objected, but the evidence was overwhelming. A chain of corruption forged link by link in the light of day. Rook himself sat silently, his face a pale, sweating mask of fury. He saw his meticulously constructed empire crumbling around him. The law, which he had bent and twisted to his own will, was now a weapon turned against him. Judge Thorne looked at Rook, his eyes cold. "Mr. Rook," he said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "do you have any response to these grave allegations?" Rook stood up, but he didn't look at the judge. He looked at the crowd, at the faces of the people he had tried to swindle, who were now staring at him with open contempt. In that moment, the thin veneer of his civility cracked, and the desperate, cornered animal beneath was revealed. His hand moved like a snake, snatching a pistol from a hidden holster under his coat. In the same motion, he lunged sideways, grabbing the person nearest to him. It was Nora Bell, who had been standing near the front, taking notes. He hooked his arm around her neck, pressing the barrel of the pistol to her temple. The room erupted in a collective gasp of horror. Nora, to her credit, didn't scream. Her face went pale, but her eyes were wide with fury, not fear. "Nobody moves," Rook screamed, his voice raw with panic. "This is not over." He began to back away, dragging Nora with him, using her as a human shield. "Clear a path, I'm walking out of here." The crowd scrambled back in terror. Sheriff Brody, a man who should have taken command, simply stood there, his mouth agape, utterly useless. Jonah Pike drew his weapon, but he had no clear shot. Cole moved, his own pistol appearing in his hand as if by magic. He didn't raise it. He simply held it, his eyes locked on Rook, his face a mask of cold concentration. He began to follow them, his limp pronounced but his purpose clear. "Let her go, Rook," Cole said, his voice calm and deadly. "It's over." "It's over when I say it is," Rook shrieked, his eyes wild. He backed out of the town hall doors and into the square, pulling Nora with him. He was heading for the watering station at the edge of town, where horses were always kept saddled. As they stumbled out into the open, the rain, which had been holding off, began to fall again. Not a gentle shower, but a sudden, torrential downpour. The dusty square turned to a slick red mud almost instantly. Rook, his fine leather shoes ill-suited for the terrain, was halfway to the stables when his foot slipped in the greasy mud. He staggered, his grip on Nora loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all the opening she needed. She stomped down hard on his instep with the heel of her boot and drove her elbow back into his ribs. He grunted in pain, his arm flailing. As he fought to regain his balance, his foot slipped again. He went down, landing hard in the mud. The pistol flew from his grasp, landing with a wet smack a few feet away. Cole was there in an instant, not with a bullet, but with a purpose. He kicked the fallen gun away into a puddle. He didn't shoot the disarmed, pathetic man struggling in the mud. Instead, he reached down, hauled Rook to his feet, and twisted his arm behind his back in a hold that was brutally efficient. Justice, in that moment, was not the clean, swift finality of a gunshot, but the messy, deliberate process of the law. Jonah Pike, his gun now holstered, came forward with a set of iron cuffs and formally took Silas Rook into custody. The fight for Red Butte was over. The resolution was swift and decisive. Judge Thorne nullified the auction and voided all of Rook's fraudulent water tariffs. He ordered Rook's assets seized to provide compensation for the ranchers he had targeted, including a generous fund to rebuild the Wynn's barn and cistern. Sheriff Brody was stripped of his badge on the spot, and Judge Thorne appointed Jonah Pike as acting sheriff until a proper election could be held. A decision met with a roar of approval from the town. Mac Delaney and his men were rounded up and held, their reign of intimidation finished. 2 weeks later, the valley had begun to heal. The rains had come in earnest, turning the parched land a hopeful shade of green. The sounds of hammering and sawing echoed from the Wynn farm as a new, larger barn rose from the ashes of the old one. In the late afternoon, with the smell of wet earth and new-cut pine in the air, Eliza and Cole stood in the meadow behind the house. The cattle grazed peacefully, their bells a gentle, random music. Cole no longer needed his crutch, though he still walked with a slight limp that Eliza suspected would always be a part of him, a physical reminder of the valley's fight. He turned to her, a slow, tired smile spreading across his face, a smile that finally reached the depths of his blue eyes. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, "that newspaper headline got me thinking." Eliza felt her heart give a little flutter. "Did it now?" "It did," he confirmed, taking a step closer. He took her hands in his. It seems the first part came true. "Farm girl nurses the injured rich cowboy." He paused, his gaze holding hers, all the wit and humor gone, replaced by a sincere, profound gravity. "If you'll let me, Eliza, I'd like to make the last part come true as well. I want to spend the rest of my life earning the right to be her beloved groom." Tears welled in Eliza's eyes, but she blinked them back, a radiant smile breaking through. The grand, sweeping romance of the newspaper headline dissolved into the simple, solid reality of the man standing before her, a man she had nursed, fought beside, and come to love with a fierceness that surprised her. "Well then," she said, her voice wonderfully steady, "you can start by helping me finish that new water cistern, and then we can plan for a simple wedding, just as soon as the rainy season is over." Their wedding was a small, joyful affair held right there in the meadow. Mabel baked a towering, lopsided cake, and Doc Finch was seen laughing, a rare and startling sight. Nora Bell wrote another story for the Chronicle, this one not about heroes and villains, but about community. No one owns the water, her article concluded, only the responsibility to share it. The last piece of their rebuilding was the new cistern, twice the size of the old one, a symbol of their renewed hope before the first winter snow. Cole hired a stone carver from Salt Lake City, and on the side of the tank, where the bullet hole had once been, the carver etched a simple, lasting epitaph for their struggle. It did not bear their names, only a quiet dedication to the principle they had fought for those who stayed kind. Thank you for listening to our story. We'd love to hear where you're listening from in the comments below so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can reach more ears.